Hello and welcome to another episode of the Ancient Warfare podcast. My name is Jasper Oorthuis. I'm the editor of Ancient Warfare magazine, and with me are Mark DeSantis, Mark McCaffrey, Lindsay Powell, and Murray Dahm. And Murray is the assistant editor of the magazine, and you'll probably hear him every week on Ancient Warfare Answers. And if you don't, did you know that we have a weekly episode that is much shorter than this, but it's all just Murray Dahm answering your questions?
Trying to answer your questions.
Well, yeah, people who have listened to this podcast will know that the "we don't know" is a very common answer,
but truthful.
Well, we try to be,
and we also have a little brother podcast in the Ancient History podcast too, don't we?
Yes, Ancient History magazine, our little sister magazine, has started a podcast, and I think those episodes are very good. They're interviews with people who actually know stuff, unlike us. Well, we know stuff, but we talk. I mean, never mind. Keep digging. As usual, we are starting in chaos. This time, we're discussing the latest issue of the magazine, which is Ancient Warfare, issue 17.2, the invasion of Greece by the Celts. And if you're still around by the end of the year, we will be switching because issue 17.6 is the 100th issue of Ancient Warfare magazine, and after that we will switch to issue 101, 102, because it's slightly easier to read for people, especially people who may not be very well versed in Roman numerals and or who find the number of little I's next to the V a bit hard to read when you get to 18. And then if we got to 19, we'd have to think, are we going to do like Legio Nona Hispana, that switches between IX and VIII. This is all very much by the way, but just sort of information that this is coming in the near future.
My very first university courses were Ancient History 101, 102, 103 back in New Zealand. So issue 101 will be very university course-esque for my brain.
Whereas it should be C1 or CII.
No.
We could, Lindsay, but then we would just be confusing people. And this is not what we do. This might be a side effect of what we do, but it's not our purpose.
We could be like Twitter and have in brackets the Roman numerals, the journal number formerly known as 18. No. No, sorry.
Let's try to get back on track, and I apologize to anyone who has already lost the plot. Yes, the invasion of Greece by the Celts in the early 3rd century BC. Perhaps we should talk about something a couple things. One thing is something that people who have read the magazine will have read, is that issue came without the centerfold, and that was because despite his best efforts, the centerfold illustrator, Zvonimir Basic, got hospitalized around the deadline time, and he did try to finish the illustration, but he couldn't get it done on time, and he thought it might be for a day, but then it ended up being longer, and we couldn't wait. At some point we have to say we can't wait for what's happening, and we have to go to print because print deadlines are print deadlines. Fortunately, he is out of hospital, but he's definitely taken a beating, I think. And I hope to get back in touch with him and see. Hopefully, we can present that centerfold at some point in the future.
Ooh, a double centerfold issue.
Well, nice. Maybe we'll see what happens. What situation he's in. I think there was bad news. At least initially, there seemed to be bad news about his ability to keep on illustrating. So who knows what happened.
Well, we wish him well then. Fast recovery.
Exactly. That's what I wanted to say. I wanted to wish him well. Second is that in the issue, we tried to edit everything consistently so that the Celts were always called the Celts. But many articles actually came in calling the Celts the Gauls. And there is good reason to do that, but we chose to keep it to Celts alone because we didn't want to confuse people, despite what you just heard. But perhaps that is a good point to begin. Why? Maybe Murray can illuminate that point. Why could it be reasonable to also call them the Gauls? You said something about that on the cover section at the very end of the magazine.
Yes, I mean, look, it's one of those probably one of those modern. My a special bugbear is the idea of copper alloy as a phrase, which is a very modern take. If it's not got zinc in it, it's bronze. So that's my sort of current bugbear with modern phrases. And I think, they used to be the Gauls, and the Gauls was a very umbrella term that captured all of the Celtic civilizations of what is now France and Belgium and parts of other nations in Europe. And of course, also extending all the way down to the Gallic empires at the close of the Roman Empire. So what Celtic gives you is a much more culturally specific, starting with Latine and the other Celtic cultures. And so I think there's been a trend now to describe a lot of the earlier activities of Celtic tribes as Celtic rather than Gallic. And so it's a really peculiar one because you've got this idea of, like, for instance, with the Celtic invasion of Italy in 390 BC, you still have people calling that the Gauls, the Senones. So it's a Gallic invasion of Italy, and then it's a Celtic invasion of Greece. So it's not something that's universally applied.
Well, it comes down to language, a lot of it. And it's like, because it is like the Keltoi is the Greek and the Galli is going to be the Latin. And I think also...
Strabo also used the Gallic
I
one.
know, well, yeah. But I mean, in terms of predominantly, in thinking about, what aspect of scholarship you're sort of coming from, I think there's an influence there. And that hence you've got more of the, the Galli in terms of across from the Western aspect as such. And
yeah, we're not the first to not apply the term universally properly. And I mean, you get the same with the Getae and the Daci, or the Daci or the Dacians, which is which. Are they a subset of each other? Are they the same? Are they just different terms? And I think that's one of the issues. And it's where archaeology, of course, is a really useful tool, because you get these archaeological finds that tell you the spread of influence of a particular culture in quite surprising directions in some cases. I mean, the Celtic influence is probably most obvious to anyone who's a military historian in the oval shield of the Celts initially, well before we know that the Italians start using oval shields, which they seem to do after the invasion of 390 BC. Then, of course, you get the Thurophoroi and the Thoricitai in Hellenistic kingdoms. Where does that come from? It starts in the 3rd century BC, but is it after Pyrrhus has seen oval shields in Italy, or is it after the Celtic invasion of Greece? And then they adopt when they lose at the Battle of Delphi, presumably hundreds, if not thousands, of oval shields left lying around. So therefore, let's make some of those. So
yeah, but because that makes sense, you adopt the shields of somebody who lost.
Well, I think it's that idea of, there's an argument that the oval shield allows you to press closer in close order, because you haven't got as much room on the side of an aspis as you had. And so that could lead to the adoption of this shield. Mind you, we're told 50,000 go to Delphi and get defeated, and barely one of them makes it home alive. So presumably, therefore, 40,000 shields lying around. That's a great resource, regardless of whether they're not very good shields, But that's that you could quite easily equip an army with those sort of spoils of war. I mean, in the male coats is the other. We know it's a Celtic invention, and it spreads from the Celtic cultures southwards and westwards. So the Celtic invasions are quite remarkable, because presumably the number of suits of armor that were left behind.
But then isn't there a debate as to how much the Celts are actually using mail, in terms of, is it the elite only, or is it, and when it sort of gets adopted by these Mediterranean cultures, it seems much more standard than it was with the Celts as such.
I think it's also one of those ideas of a suit of mail well repaired, and we know from some of the archaeological finds of suits of mail, which are rare, they are repaired, and we're often in the archaeological reports, which we were talking about off air, we are told that we're not sure, except that the repair was done less well than the initial build. But what you're dealing with then is suits of armor that have been worn for long periods of time, not campaigns or a lifetime, but literally shared by generations. And the idea of a helmet and a shield and a spear and a sword being generational suddenly starts to make a suit of armor decades, if not centuries, old, which implies that, yes, they're expensive, but if you've got one and Grandad had it and you've fallen on hard times, you can still put on Grandad's suit of, chainmail. So it could be that over that stretch of time, those sorts of accoutrements become more common because, yes, they take a lot of time. I think it's 200 man-hours to make a suit of mail, I think is the estimate. Yes, they're taking a long time to build, but once they're built...
200 seems probably very fast, actually.
Well, yeah, certainly if you're going to rivet them individually like they would appear to have done, yes.
Yeah, I mean, somewhere between, 30 to 40,000 rings?
Yeah, probably. Based on my experience with the Ermine Street Guard, and we certainly weren't butting them and riveting them.
So, I think the time and expense could be sort of mitigated by, but this will be around for a while once you've got one. And I think like with helmet typologies, we're not sure. We like to put helmets into this one lasted the week of June in 53 BC and was replaced by the next one. Whereas the reality is it probably was worn for a lot longer than some typologies would tell us. So I think that spread of Celtic weaponry and equipment is a fascinating aspect, but probably the most obvious one of Celtic influence. You've got the Galatians, which we've had issues of the magazine on before, and that's all, of course, at the end of the invasion when they're destroyed. Some go to Asia Minor, others have a very brief culture that exists near Bithynia, which gets destroyed, and then there's a fabulous story about gold going all the way back to Toulouse, to Tolosa, which then gets dug up by a Roman a couple of centuries later, the gold of Tolosa, and it's cursed. It was apparently a phrase in common use in Rome was, he's got the gold of Tolosa, meaning he's stuffed, basically.
I just wanted to add that if anybody watching has got Ancient History, issue 33, I wrote an article about all of this. It's called Always Ready for Fighting, the Celts at War. So plug there for Ancient History magazine, just thought I'd throw it in. Issue 33. And
going back to the question I asked originally, I mean, Gaul, of course, is strongly associated with France, which is another reason, is undoubtedly in part due, thank you, to Julius Caesar and his Gallic War, which, and anybody knows, is of course in modern day France, where there's been a lot of research. But as Murray just mentioned, we were talking about the Galatians, or the remains of the Gallic invasion in Greece, and then you start with Toulouse in southern France. So how'd they end up from the western end of the Mediterranean suddenly in northern Greece to come and make a mess, from the Greek point of view anyway?
Well, the cultural migration of those cultures that spreads across Greece. And, again, our best evidence is from Julius Caesar, where you get the description of Gallic peoples wanting to do mass migrations with their entire population. And that, of course, is the pretext for the whole Gallic War. But it seems that earlier, and, again, when you look at the causes of the Celtic invasion of Italy, which led to the Battle of the Allia, that's the same, that the population pressures have pushed various tribes of Celtic peoples away from their homelands.
But then that's one argument in terms of the migration theory, but at the same time, okay, maybe the Galatians is a clear example of migration happening. But on the other hand, something like the pushing down from the north into northern Italy and that becoming Cisalpine Gaul, as such, from the Roman perspective at least, may not have actually been migration in terms of people, but rather in terms of a culture spreading down and actually being adopted by the local population in terms of the Latin culture, not just in terms of weaponry, but in terms of their other aspects of religion, in terms of everything down to their beakers and terms of their pots,
or good old fashioned conquest. That's they're supplanting locals. But I think the issue is then, of course, with the Greek invasion, you then have a similar invasion which takes longer to get to Greece, in the sense that whilst those are happening, and that's in the 4th century BC, similar cultural influences you can detect going across Western France and then through the Western passes, shall we call them, and then down the Balkans and eventually reaching and making contact with Greece. As you said before, there's Celtic mercenaries during the Alexandrian period.
There are Gallic mercenaries also serving with Carthaginian armies during the Punic Wars, so in large numbers. And it would seem that there was a surplus of young warriors who were interested in any sort of chance to make money, find their fortunes. Some of them would have gone on invasions of Greece, but others might have taken service with the Carthaginians, for what would have been steady pay, at least in the middle of the century.
Well, that theory, in terms of the Gestatai, in terms of a portion of the youth of the Gallic nations or the Gallic tribes being sort of not quite expelled, but sent out to sow their oats, wild oats, in terms of their conquest, and not actually having to prove themselves as a warrior within their culture, within their local tribal area, but actually going on those foreign campaigns, being adopted as mercenaries. It seems to be a very common route for the development of the warrior culture within or across Gallic culture.
Well, it's funny because that's very long lasting. That's also the explanation for the Anglo-Saxon invasions of England in the 6th centuries. That exact same youth having to prove themselves outside their own tribe, or being expelled because population pressures and whatever.
That also sounds much like the Germanic just peoples in general. That is, the young warriors would be the ones going out on the raids. So there's a similarity.
Mark, many of those so-called Germans were actually Celts. Certainly the ones close to the Rhine were actually not Germanic in the sense we think of having different, but they were actually racially, culturally.
Yeah. And it does bring up a very interesting question, is that if you were going to ask the people that we would call Celts or Gauls, are you a Celt or are you a Gaul, would they have recognized that term, either of those terms? I mean, they would probably thought of themselves as being very distinct from the other tribes and peoples that Greeks and Romans lumped them in together with. So,
and I think the other issue, as always, is that we rely on Greek and Latin sources that don't necessarily distinguish peoples when there was distinguishing aspects of peoples. And you certainly get that later. I think Marcus Aurelius talks about the fact that you can't tell a Sarmatian from a Marcomanni, from a Suebi, from a such and such, that they all look the same to them, which is, again, a trope of the indistinguishable nature of, whereas today, if you mistake people that to us as white Europeans and North Americans as someone from a particular culture because they look like they're from that culture, and in fact you find no, they're from a completely distinct culture, and how offensive that is. I mean, as a New Zealander living in Australia, I get it all the time too. But that idea of, yes, there are cultural distinctions that you as the foreign source can't picture and can't distinguish. And then, of course, we're relying on Polybius or Pausanias or someone else, or Strabo, talking about these tribes and how they moved. And that could be completely false because, they have a narrative about these population pressures and these migrations that actually might be completely wrong. But that's the source that we have for it. And other than archaeology, we can't really find another narrative.
No, but of course, for the Celts, we have a whole lot of archaeology. and it's the point that Alberto Perez makes. It's a culture that spreads, not necessarily, we can't distinguish whether there's any ethnic identity or nationality. It's a culture that spreads and perhaps gets, indeed, as you mentioned before, gets adopted by other people who pick it up and then sort of become the same. And we just, we don't even, language is there anything that we know about that?
There is some records of Celtic language, but it's recorded using either the Greek or the Latin script. And again, that's restrictive or it's manipulated. And then the ones, I think there's some from the west of Britain, there's some from today France. But again, what is recorded are very minute and not able to be reflective of the entire dialect that whatever they come from. And so you can't actually distinguish between what were the dialects, how many, etc.
I think the population shifting over decades and, centuries is less exciting history from our sources' perspective than bursts of activity and, individuals being aggressive and opportunism. And I think the invasion of Greece is all of those latter things. But we have that issue, for instance, the name of Brennus is associated with both the Gallic invasion of Italy in 390 BC, and he's one of the leaders of the invasion of Greece. Not the same person. 2 centuries, the same name, which has led in the past to people saying, is that actually not a name? It's attached by our sources as a name, but in fact is a misunderstanding of titles. And you get that same idea later with destabilize in the Dacian context, that Durapenus is actually the name and destabilize is the rank, or the other way around, I can't remember. So that idea of actually we're given the activities of a group as a natural progression of what they've been doing for decades, and it's given an individual leader who says to the Celts as a group, Greece is ripe for the plundering, all of the riches of Delphi and all of the riches of these great Greek cities, let's go and take them. And that makes more exciting history from our sources' perspective, and also more, deliberate and immediate, rather than, this was something that had been going on for the last 50 years and we were the next step. That's not the narrative we're given in the sources. It's no, this one person noticed how wealthy we were and inspired all of the Celts to attack us because they wanted to plunder us. That's sort of the motivation of, how you get this invasion happening. Whereas the reality is perhaps this natural progression of cultural spread.
Still, I mean, even if it's the youth that has to prove itself, it's a very large number of younglings that come boiling over the mountains.
So the Celts, if I've got this right, they're known for being a warlike people, but on the other hand, they're farmers. So they're going to be grazing animals, and they're going to be moving with the flocks, and they're going to look for pasture and so on. And if I've got this correct, for example, part of the reason why the Gauls were a problem for Julius Caesar was the invasions coming over the Alps or something, and they felt that was a problem. But I'm going to guess it's a combination of things. It's one, you've got just the need to feed your livestock, so you're going to go to the next green field over the hill, and there's nobody there, you'll take it. On the other hand, we keep hearing about movements because there are people behind these people who are causing problem. They have to keep moving ever west to deal with that threat. So maybe there's a couple of dynamics here.
Well, it's interesting because most of those invasions of pressures from other populations pushing you out is much later and generally associated with the Huns or the Shongu or whoever they are, pushing tribes that then reach the Danube and Rhine tribes and push them westwards. Whereas this one is the other way earlier. So you've actually got Gallic tribes or Celtic tribes moving, what's this direction? Down Europe, whatever that is. Down Europe-wards. There you go. That's my specifics. Down Europe-wards. And yeah, so that is in the opposite direction. And I think when you look at the history of migrations, there's a whole bunch of crisscrossing happening at various different millennia of history where, now there's a southwards during the Ice Age, then there's a eastwards, then there's a westwards, then there's a northwards.
You've got the Cimbri and the Teutones as well, for another example in terms of that moving not from east to west, but rather somewhat more easterly direction. And again, you've got the theories there, not necessarily of people coming behind them, but rather of some sort of climate change situation whereby there's inundation of fields, a loss of available farming fields, and therefore they've gotten on the move to actually find or explore new territories.
Yeah, how far they move is always fascinating in terms of the distances they are.
But again, it's like a pinball machine, isn't it? In terms of once you sort of get on the move and you're looking for this new land, and if you receive enough resistance, then you're going to keep moving. So,
and again, I think the fascinating aspect of Julius Caesar, whether he's a reliable narrator or not, the diplomatic maneuverings of all of this, of can we have permission to enter through your territory? Can we cross your river? Can we do this? Can we do that? Which Julius Caesar describes as, weren't given permission, were given permission. There's sort of a pinball, that's the word you was using, pinball effect that channels these tribes in a particular direction. And so when you go back to the Cimbri and the Teutones and the Gallic invasions, we don't have that record of the diplomatic negotiation of these cultures and tribes moving. It's much vaguer, and it is this greener fields idea. But probably that diplomatic negotiation of, can we pass through your territory this summer in order to get to the richer fields beyond you, must have been occurring in cultural exchange from these places.
Well, you've got it when you get to Vercingetorix. It's there. There's that hint of there's an underlying, not necessarily even amongst the leaders of the tribe, but amongst the aristocracy, there is that connection that can be turned to.
Yeah. And I think, again, because we're talking cultures and we're talking languages, which most of the evidence for us has disappeared, you've actually got wide networks of cultural similarity and probably mythologies of connections, Teutates and the other gods that are. And one of the things, of course, about a polytheistic environment is that their god, oh, yeah, we know your god. Your god's this god. Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you're fine. Oh, you worship Mars. Great. Well, yeah, but he's not called Mars. Oh, well, that's fine. He's still Mars. That in a way allows similarity and familiarity in a way that religious difference does not. I think, which is fascinating. But you've also got trade networks. The trade of amber and tin and metalwork from the Celts is something that spreads and therefore allows familiarity with that culture and, creates networks.
And you've not mentioned Druids here, of course, in terms of that. Again, it's that's another misunderstanding in terms of, the common idea of it being a religious element, but rather probably being more like a diplomatic element between tribes.
Yeah, well, and intermarriage. I mean, that's probably one of the things that, has always connected communities who may be loosely connected prior, is to create a marriage alliance with the family of a close by neighbor that makes your tribe stronger. So all of those things, I think, are less exciting history from our sources' perspective than an individual motivated by vengeance, greed, ambition, genius, whichever. And that certainly tends to be what we get emphasized. And certainly the Celtic invasion of Greece is emphasized by, this numberless horde being inspired by the amount of wealth able to be taken off from Greece. And so they invade and are repelled and then invade again. So, there's the 3 invasions, and then we get this odd, and then there's another invasion led by Brennus. And so that idea of, well, hang on, what happened to the other 3? So it's not quite as clear cut as we're told. And then of course, the Battle of Thermopylae, in 279 is very much a repeat of what happened 200 years earlier, because they find the past, they're led through, and that's in the issue, the Battle of Thermopylae, and how much it parallels what happened in the 480 invasion. And then, of course, they move on Delphi, which also the Persians did. And again, you start to get worried now, because the reason that the Celts are defeated at Delphi is less to do with a military victory and more to do with the gods' intervention. Thunder, lightning, fog, rolling stones. Mick Jagger is a mighty weapon. But the idea is that, there's an exact parallel. There is no Salamis and there is no Plataea for this invasion. It's very much that when they're defeated at Delphi, that's the end of the invasion, and they hightail it out of Greece. And barely a man gets out alive, is the phrase we have in Pausanias. It's a really interesting, different and yet the same, and the Greeks live to fight another day.
It's interesting that you said numberless horde, because of course in the issue numbers are mentioned. It's what I forget, is it somewhere between 50 and 150,000 depending on how you count, and whether the cavalry gets servants and we should count them or not, and how the various columns diverge. But we've had previous episodes and issues talking about logistics of ancient armies, and the preparations that go, and the amounts that are consumed by even a very small army of, maybe a legion and a couple of auxiliary units, say 10,000 men and their animals, is staggering very quickly, and will just clean out any town of even a reasonable size in no time flat. Unfortunately, the ancient authors, of course, are not very interested in the logistics at all, let alone in the logistics of barbarians who seem to just live of, sky and rage. But would that put a limit on the numbers that we are given?
Yes, definitely. But I think the issue, numbers in the ancient sources is always an issue. So hang on, there we are. Here we are. I found it. We get 152,000 infantry and 20,400 cavalry. But then this fascinating aspect that the number of horsemen, in fact, is triple that, because you have each horseman has two servants who can replace them or bring them a new horse. So you've got 210,000 men, and it's unclear if this is 210,000 men per column, so you've actually got 600,000 men, or if that 200,000 men is the total that then gets split into three and then gets amassed again into a single remnant of veterans for Brennus. And so when he attacks Delphi, it's 40,000 men, I think, is the number he takes to Delphi. And those numbers all are unbelievably high for us today. And the logistics question is one of, okay, so we know from general equipping ideas that you can't carry more than 3 days water personally. And so where is it coming from? If you're going to be in the field for longer, where are you getting fodder, food, and water for your horde, in addition to the local population who presumably live within their means in that community? So when you put that pressure on a local community, if you're taking everything there is to eat and drink from a local area, there is nothing left for the locals. And I think the story of deprivation and when an invading force has been a long one in the history of warfare, and that leads to populations leaving areas and moving because there's nothing left for them. Yeah, I think it would be very interesting to actually break down what these numbers mean in reality, because we're given numbers all of the time, vast numbers, huge numbers, none of which we believe, but we're stuck with modern guesses as to how much smaller those numbers actually are. And then we're given other numbers, the 300 at Thermopylae, the 192 Athenian dead at Marathon, which we do believe. And, we go, well, these numbers are reliable. So where in the stepping of the numbers do the numbers cease to be reliable and become unreliable? Where is that moment? I think, if you're going to reduce the horde, and we have to reduce the horde, because I think part of the, when you read Herodotus's numbers, they're meant to overawe you as a number. The 5 million men is meant to be, oh my gosh, rather than literally 5 million men. But is the 200,000 Celts similarly meant to overawe us as a number, as opposed to it actually being, this is the whole population? The other idea, of course, with Celtic and people movements is that number is the entire population. And you get that with the later Gothic invasions, that 300,000 is the entire population of the culture. So therefore, half of those are women, more of those are older men and younger boys. So the warrior component is a much smaller number. Now, the ancient source doesn't give us that. It just gives us the number. And so we're going, oh, well, we need to reduce it. Here's how we can reduce it by more than half. Look, it's a manageable number of 35,000. Excellent. We're much happier with 35,000.
Oddly enough, all those women and children and old people also have to eat.
Yes, but not fight necessarily. But then we have stories where they do fight, and you're like, oh, that just messes our numbers. But I think the other thing with a lot of these places is, looking at Delphi and the talk of the advance on Delphi, that number of people moving, even very tightly packed, is going to crowd the approaches, and it's going to be a very long column to get that number of people to Delphi. And fighting wise, where are they going to amass? They're going to be only able to put a frontage of a couple of hundred people forward, and the defenders can probably defend with very few too. This is not the plain of Plataea or the plain of Leuctra. This is the quite mountainous approach to Delphi. So, Thermopylae also, with all these wonderful stories of how many thousands of men fight in Thermopylae, but we're told, back in Herodotus, that the 300 Spartans can block the pass. So it's not a wide space where thousands of men can fight.
These invasions, both in Italy and Greece, have a great legacy as well in terms of they've got a life after in the sources. And I think, again, the numbers are there to have that cultural impact. Like, for example, the Terra Gallicae that continues throughout the centuries in Rome, despite the fact that actually there's no Gallic threat for any of those centuries afterwards, and yet it remains as a very steadfast part of Roman culture.
Yeah, I mean, more than Hannibal even, because he didn't take Rome. So there's the Cimbrian, the Teutones threat, and then the Gallic threat from 390. That's the one that keeps getting brought up again when later invasions occur, which is just amazing to have that, like when you get Stilicho and Alaric in the early 5th century, it's the invasion of the Gauls in 390 BC that's harked to. And you're like, that's a long time ago that you have a cultural memory of this, threat. So I don't know if it's quite the same in Greece. I don't know that there is. I mean, obviously Greece is conquered, 100 years later by the Romans, but I don't know that there is a similar longevity of the Gallic threat. Our best source is Pausanias, for the Celtic invasion.
Does Diodorus Siculus have anything to say on any of this?
Ooh.
In his Library of History? Because I think he gives some of the best descriptions of Celtic warriors. I'm just wondering if there's more context that goes with it.
Doesn't look to be. I think
Mostly missing for that particular time, early 3rd century.
So we don't know, to quote our leader.
It is a topic that we most do not know a lot about, but yes, oddly enough, reverberated throughout the ancient world for centuries. Is that a good bombshell? I think it's a good bombshell. On that bombshell, thank you all very much. See you again soon. Bye-bye.